There's a certain kind of war movie that doesn't just tell you a story. It plants itself in your skull and refuses to leave. Full Metal Jacket is that movie. Stanley Kubrick's 1987 Vietnam picture, adapted from Gustav Hasford's novel The Short-Timers, split audiences into two halves the same way it split its own runtime. A boot camp section so merciless that people still quote it at parties, and a combat section so cold and disorienting that critics are still arguing about what it means. Matthew Modine played the wisecracking Joker. Vincent D'Onofrio played the doomed Private Pyle. And R. Lee Ermey, playing drill instructor Gunnery Sergeant Hartman, turned into one of the most quoted characters in movie history. But almost none of that was supposed to happen the way it happened. Behind the film's cold, clinical surface is a production full of accidents, near misses, injuries, and decisions made on the fly by a director who was famous for controlling every single frame. Here are 15 facts about Full Metal Jacket that show just how much chaos it took to make something that looks so precise. When R. Lee Ermey signed on to Full Metal Jacket, his job title was technical advisor, not actor. It was a role he knew well. He'd done the same thing on Apocalypse Now and on 1978's The Boys in Company C, using his real military background to consult on films while quietly angling for a part in front of the camera. This time, though, Kubrick wasn't interested. He'd already seen Ermey act in The Boys in Company C and decided he simply wasn't vicious enough to play a drill instructor on screen. The role of Hartman had already gone to Tim Calseri, a former Marine hired specifically for the part. Ermey didn't let that stop him. As part of his actual job, he was tasked with helping Calseri rehearse by hurling insults at a group of extras being considered for background roles, footage that was really meant to teach Calseri how a real drill instructor strips away a recruit's individuality. Ermey used it as his own audition instead. He kept going well past the point where Calseri's voice would give out, reportedly improvising something in the neighborhood of 150 pages of insults over the course of the sessions, according to Kubrick's own account in a later Rolling Stone interview. He also had stagehands throw tennis balls and oranges at him mid-tirade, just to prove he could hold character under pressure. Kubrick watched the tapes. He decided Ermey wasn't just usable, he was, in his words, a genius for this part. Calseri was moved into the smaller role of the unhinged helicopter door gunner as a consolation prize, and Ermey took over as Hartman, eventually improvising roughly half of his own dialogue. The technical advisor had talked his way into one of the most famous performances of the decade. Vincent D'Onofrio landed the role of Private Leonard Gomerpyle Lawrence after his friend and co-star Matthew Modine tipped him off about the production and encouraged him to send in an audition tape. He sent 4 tapes to Kubrick in England before he got the part. The character, as originally conceived, was meant to be a skinny, none too bright recruit from the countryside. Kubrick changed his mind, deciding Pyle would land harder on screen if he were big, slow, and physically overwhelmed by the world around him. That meant D'Onofrio had to gain roughly 70 pounds over about 7 months, pushing his weight from a lean, athletic build-up to somewhere around 280 pounds at the time, reportedly more than what Robert De Niro had gained for Raging Bull a few years earlier. He later told the Chicago Tribune that the change reached every part of him. My thighs were tremendous, my arms were tremendous, even my nose was fat. The physical cost was real. During the film's grueling obstacle course sequences, he injured his knee badly enough to require surgery. The stranger toll was social. D'Onofrio has said in interviews that once he'd shaved his head and packed on the weight, people started treating him differently, repeating things to him twice, as though they doubted he'd understood the first time, and generally reacting to him the way people react to someone they've written off. Rather than fight that feeling, he leaned into it, funneling that sense of being dismissed directly into Pyle's slow unraveling. It took him 9 months after filming Wrap to lose the weight again. Most directors making a Vietnam War film would go looking for jungle. Stanley Kubrick, who had a well-documented fear of flying and lived on a country estate outside London, wasn't going to get on a plane for anyone. So instead of traveling to Southeast Asia, or even to a tropical stand-in location, he built his version of Vietnam in East London. The site he chose was the Beckton Gas Works, a sprawling, disused coal gas plant on the Thames that had been scheduled for demolition. According to several accounts of the production, including reporting collected by film historians and design retrospectives on production designer Anton Furst. Part of the reasoning was architectural. The industrial, boxy, functionalist style of Becton's 1930s-era buildings actually resembled the kind of French colonial industrial architecture found in the real city of Hue, the setting for the film's climactic battle. Kubrick had pored over hundreds of U.S. State Department photographs of the real Vietnam while researching the film, and he became convinced the resemblance wasn't just coincidence. He'd reportedly noticed similar architecture in photos of buildings near Hue itself. Whether that architectural echo was as clean a match as Kubrick liked to claim in interviews is something film historians still debate, but the effect worked. Crews spent weeks partially demolishing Becton's buildings with explosives and heavy machinery, then had art department staff go back over the wreckage with sledgehammers and even a modified flamethrower to distress the walls further. Vietnamese signage, pulled from magazines sourced through the Library of Congress and blown up to billboard size, went up over the ruins. A director who refused to leave England ended up with one of the most convincing recreations of a Vietnamese battlefield ever put on film, without ever setting foot in Vietnam. Turning a derelict gasworks into a bombed-out Asian city was one problem. Turning the same site into a tropical jungle for the film's field and combat sequences was another problem entirely, especially since much of the location work happened during a cold, wet English winter. Production designer Anton Furst, the same man who would later win an Academy Award for building Gotham City in Tim Burton's Batman 2 years later, brought in roughly 200 real palm trees, shipped up from Spain, with some accounts noting they originated even further south, trucked through Morocco, Spain, and France to reach the set. English weather was not kind to them. The trees needed constant watering just to survive the shoot, and the local fire brigade was reportedly called in to help keep them hydrated. On top of the real palm trees, the production brought in roughly 100,000 artificial tropical plants sourced from Hong Kong to fill out the greenery and disguise which foliage was real. The bigger challenge was the skyline. Tilt a camera even slightly upward at Becton, and the illusion collapsed instantly. Suddenly you were looking at East London rooftops instead of the Far East. First solution was to stack enormous, colorful shipping containers around the perimeter of the set, blocking the skyline while simultaneously adding to the sense of a bombed-out, scavenged war zone. It was, by his own account, a cheap and efficient way to erase England from the shot. 2 years later, Furst would take some of that same broad stroke, not historically accurate design philosophy and apply it to an entirely fictional city, winning an Oscar in the process. The Becton Gas Works had spent nearly a century processing coal gas before it was decommissioned, and that history left the soil and structures soaked in industrial residue that nobody fully briefed the cast on before filming began. Matthew Modine has discussed the toxic conditions of the set in multiple interviews over the years, describing coming back to his hotel after a day of shooting, running a bath, and watching the water discolor as whatever had settled on his skin during filming came back off. Beyond what landed on the skin, the controlled explosions used to create the bombed-out look at Becton kicked up enormous amounts of century-old industrial dust into the air, dust that settled over the entire set, including the catering area where cast and crew ate their meals between takes. Modine has spoken about lingering respiratory issues he attributes to the months spent filming there, describing it as one of the more physically punishing environments he's worked in. It's a detail that adds a strange layer of authenticity to the film's exhausted, hollowed-out performances. The cast wasn't just acting worn down. Some of them genuinely were. The Full Metal Jacket most people picture, Modine, D'Onofrio, Ermey, Adam Baldwin as Animal Mother, is nowhere close to the cast Kubrick originally had in mind. Kubrick reportedly wanted Anthony Michael Hall, fresh off his teen movie breakout in 16 Candles, for the role of Joker, but months of negotiations collapsed over money and the length of the filming commitment. The role of Animal Mother tells a similar story. According to production records referenced by Kubrick historians, Arnold Schwarzenegger was considered for the part before ultimately turning it down to instead star in 1987's The Running Man, a decision that opened the door for Adam Baldwin. Around the same period, Denzel Washington, then still an up-and-coming actor, was in the mix for the role of Corporal 8-Ball, but reportedly passed on the part after not having had time to read the script ahead of his audition, Washington has since said publicly that he came to regret the decision, though the role ultimately went to Dorian Harewood. Perhaps the strangest almost casting involves Bill McKinney, the actor best remembered as the squeal-like-a-pig antagonist from Deliverance. According to accounts of the production, McKinney was actually offered the role of Hartman at one point and had begun preparing to travel to London for the shoot before Kubrick, having apparently reconsidered after rewatching Deliverance, pulled the offer. McKinney reportedly still received payment for the role despite never appearing in the finished film, which is either one of the more painless disappointments in Hollywood history or one of the strangest, depending on how you look at it. Full Metal Jacket is based on Gustav Hasford's 1979 novel The Short-Timers and Kubrick, according to Wikipedia's account of the production sourced from period interviews, discovered the book after reading a review of it in the Kirkus Review in the early 1980s. He read it twice in 1982 and decided almost immediately that he wanted to adapt it, drawn to what he described as the novel's stark, almost poetic dialogue. The title, though, worried him. In military slang, a short-timer is a serviceman counting down his final days before rotating home, but Kubrick reportedly became convinced that general audiences would misread the phrase as something closer to a part-time job, undercutting the seriousness of the material. So he went looking for a replacement, eventually landing on the phrase Full Metal Jacket, a technical term from ammunition catalogs describing a bullet with a soft lead core encased in a harder metal shell. The phrase never actually appears anywhere in Hasford's novel. Kubrick built the title from scratch, and in doing so accidentally handed critics a tidy metaphor for the entire film: soft, vulnerable young men encased in a hard military shell. The making of the screenplay itself wasn't smooth, either. Kubrick brought on both as Ford and Michael Herr, the war correspondent behind the Vietnam memoir Dispatches, to co-write the adaptation with him, working largely over the phone and by mail. Her later said the collaboration felt like one phone call lasting 3 years, with interruptions. Kubrick and Hasford, by most accounts, did not get along. After one in-person meeting at Kubrick's English home went badly, the two reportedly never met again, even though Hasford retained full screenwriting credit on the finished film. The film's final act, Joker being forced to deliver a mercy killing to a wounded teenage Viet Cong sniper, is one of the most quietly devastating sequences of 1980 cinema. It's also, by several production accounts, the third version of the ending Kubrick attempted. An earlier version, closer to the novel's own brutal conclusion, had a different tone and outcome for the sniper sequence entirely, and Kubrick moved away from it as he kept refining the film's structure during shooting and editing. What he settled on gives the film a kind of symmetry that doesn't exist in the source novel. The boot camp section ends with one Marine killing another, and the war section ends with a Marine killing a child. Two different uniforms, the same collapse of the self the training was designed to produce. The actor who played the sniper, Ngoc Lu, a Vietnamese performer, had no other major film credits. This was essentially her one substantial screen role, in a scene Kubrick reportedly reworked extensively before he was satisfied it carried the moral weight he wanted. Full Metal Jacket's structure moves from boot camp to Vietnam, but the shoot itself ran in the opposite order. Production spent the early months at Baecton shooting the Vietnam combat sequences before ever moving to the studio-built barracks used for the Paris Island boot camp scenes. That meant the cast experienced the psychological wreckage of Vietnam before they ever set foot in the training that was supposed to build them up to survive it. According to the making of accounts collected by outlets like Film Forum's retrospective on the production, the reversed order came with its own physical toll. Filming through an English winter meant actors' breath was constantly fogging the camera lens during outdoor combat scenes, so the crew brought in industrial gas heaters to keep the air warm enough to shoot. The heaters solved the fogging problem, but dried out the cast's throats so badly that hoarseness became a running issue on set. The shoot, originally estimated at roughly 18 weeks, ultimately stretched to nearly 39. Production was also disrupted by a serious car accident involving R. Lee Ermey, who broke ribs on one side of his body after his car went off the road late at night in Epping Forest. He reportedly stayed conscious long enough to flag down a passing driver, which is likely what got him medical attention in time. The accident shut down production for months, and Ermey returned to filming still working through the pain. a detail some viewers have pointed to in the finished film, where his left arm barely moves in certain shots. Stanley Kubrick had a reputation for running an almost impenetrable closed set, no press access, minimal outside visitors, tight control over anything that could leak. And yet Matthew Modine spent the entire production keeping a written diary and taking photographs, seemingly with Kubrick's knowledge and, eventually, his encouragement. It reportedly began as character research. Modine was playing Joker, a marine journalist, and picked up a small notebook as a prop to help him get into character. According to Modine's own later accounts, Kubrick noticed what he was doing and, rather than shutting it down, started asking him to read entries aloud on set. A friend later gave Modine a camera to bring to London, and Kubrick, who had spent years as a photographer for Look magazine before moving into filmmaking, reportedly gave him guidance on lenses and film stock and let him shoot behind the scenes throughout production. 2 decades later, Modine published the material as Full Metal Jacket Diary, a limited print run that also became the basis for a later multimedia app version featuring his own narration over his behind-the-scenes photography. It stands as one of the only detailed, photographed, first-person records of a Kubrick production from inside the set, something the director rarely, if ever, allowed on any of his other films. Full Metal Jacket's score is a strange, mechanical, almost industrial sound that runs under much of film, and for years the credit for it belonged to a composer named Abigail Mead. Abigail Mead wasn't a real person. The name was a pseudonym for Vivian Kubrick, Stanley's daughter, reportedly named after Abbott's Mead, the property where the Kubrick family lived for over a decade. According to interviews around the film's release, Vivian wanted the score judged on its own merits rather than dismissed as a favor from her father. Kubrick reportedly didn't want a traditional orchestral score full of swelling strings. He wanted something colder and more processed. Vivian built much of the soundtrack, using early digital synthesizers of the era, instruments that were, at the time, prohibitively expensive and relatively rare in film scoring. The result leans hollow and mechanical rather than melodic, which suits a film this. Vivian also has a brief, uncredited cameo appearance in the film itself, playing a news camera operator filming near a mass grave in one of the Vietnam sequences, and in one of the outer footnotes to the story. Abigail Mead actually had a minor musical career of her own outside the film. A single built around Hartman's cadences reportedly charted in the UK and Ireland at the time, with most listeners having no idea the artist behind it was the director's daughter. The film's closing march, with the platoon singing the Mickey Mouse Club theme while walking through the burning ruins of Hue, is one of the more unsettling final images in 1980s cinema, childhood pop culture bleeding into the aftermath of war. But according to accounts of the production, that wasn't Kubrick's first idea for the sequence. Kubrick reportedly had a long-standing fascination with the Woody Woodpecker cartoons and wanted the Marines to whistle Woody's theme instead as they marched through the wreckage. The story goes that Kubrick asked Walter Lantz, Woody Woodpecker's creator, for permission to use the character across multiple films over the years, and was turned down every time. Rather than push the issue for Full Metal Jacket, he pivoted to the Mickey Mouse Club march instead, a choice that carries its own quiet joke, since Hartman mocks Pyle earlier in the film by asking, "What is this Mickey Mouse crap?" Hours later, in story time, that's exactly what the recruits are singing back. Most lines from a war film stay contained inside that film. One line from Full Metal Jacket didn't. In a brief scene, a Vietnamese sex worker, played by Papillon Su Su and credited as the Da Nang hooker, approaches 2 Marines on a street. The dialogue lasts under a minute, delivering the now notorious line about being so horny and offering to love you long time. In 1989, the Miami-based Group 2 Live crew built their song, Me So Horny, around a sample of that exact dialogue, pairing it with a groove lifted from the disco track Firecracker by Mass Production. According to Billboard's oral history of the song, group member DJ Mr. Mix has said the Full Metal Jacket clip stood out to him for how animated the delivery was. The song became a Billboard Hot Rap Tracks #1 and a Hot 100 entry, and it also became a flashpoint in a major obscenity prosecution against the group in Florida, a case that was ultimately overturned on appeal but generated enormous national attention in the process. A few years later, Sir Mix-a-Lot referenced the same sample in Baby Got Back. For a lot of listeners of a certain generation, the line reached them through hip-hop first, with the Kubrick connection only becoming clear years later when they actually sat down and watched the movie. Of all the tense moments during production, the one Matthew Modine has described as the most personally difficult didn't happen on camera at all. A few weeks into filming, Modine learned his wife was going into an emergency, premature C-section. According to Modine's own retelling, he went straight to Kubrick to ask for time off to be at the hospital, and Kubrick pushed back, arguing, among other things, that Modine wasn't a doctor, couldn't help in the delivery room,